Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Detect.sh podcast, where we learn how to build and troubleshoot reliable applications in a unique community-based approach. We started the community because we realized that detecting problems in application, there was really no place to go to gain knowledge, learn how to do it, and share lessons learned. So that's where Detect.sh came from. I'm your host, Lyndon Brown, and I'm really lucky to be joined here today by Amin Astaneh, a former Meta production engineer manager and currently partner at Certo Modo. So we're going to dive in deep with Amin. So really happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Lyndon. It's a pleasure.
Obviously, one pivotal part of your career was your experience at Facebook, now known as Meta. And we won't dive into the metaverse too much on this call, but it is, we're just telling us that story. How did you actually end up at Meta?
Yes. So I was currently at a company called Acquia at the time, and they just got acquired by Vista Equity Partners. So I was looking forward to the next opportunity. I really wanted to do something that was very large scale, and to deal with the bigger challenges. So believe it or not, at that time, I applied for Google because as a person who was running an SRE department, I was very much fanboying for Google, and I applied for them, but also applied for Facebook, hopefully to get some kind of bidding war between the two. Like that was my aspiration. The funny bit was the recruiting process between Google and Meta was night and day. They scheduled the screen, did the screen, put me on an airplane to Menlo Park, and gave me an offer by the time it took Google to get just the screen going. And I was so impressed by that process. I was like, I'm not even going to wait for Google's response. I'm going to go ahead and join Meta. And I think it was the right choice ultimately.
Yeah. And I mean, it sounds like it. And in our community, I'm sure we have a lot of people that are aspire to work at a company like Meta, et cetera. Any tips? I'm sure things have changed a bit, but what would you tell SRE now looking to get a role there?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, number one, it's not something you can just, walk into and do a good job. You have to prepare, especially for the coding interview. So definitely practice, get, example problems from Leak Code, buy the book Cracking the Coding Interview, and do the work. So prior to me doing the main interview screen or the main interview round at Meta, I spent several hours a day on time off doing just problems, and studying and getting ready for it. And I think that doing that is the most lucrative preparation you could ever do. So it's definitely worth it. But you're not just going to walk into the interview room and do a good job. You have to prepare.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you focused on the coding exercise there because I think, as you think about kind of SREs generally, there are a number of SREs who got into SRE not through the development route, right? Sysadmin route, et cetera. And maybe, bash scripts or, something along that line was really the extent of their programming experience. Like, how would you characterize the market now? Is it more, think it's more dev than ops, or what's the split?
It really depends. So here's the thing. It really depends on the company, because the definition of an SRE has gotten so muddled over the years. SRE can mean ops person, or SRE can mean its original definition, which is a software engineer that is tasked with dealing with operations, right? So when SRE was invented, in a sentence, it means this is what a software engineer would do when designing an operations function. But yes, there has been ambiguity over the years, just like the term platform engineer or cloud engineer or DevOps engineer. Like there isn't a canonical term. So you have to look at the job description. But the textbook definition is you're writing code.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, hopefully that's helpful to some of the people in our audience here in our community. But maybe let's rewind the clock a little bit and let's just talk about how did you end up in technology? Like what was your first, programming experience or your first experience with a computer? We'd love to hear it.
Sure. I have some highlights. So when I was 5 years old, I was in kindergarten, and my elementary school teacher was like, Amin, would you like to write your book report on something called a word processor on the Apple IIe? And I did that, and I was hooked. And of course, my handwriting since then has absolutely been terrible because I focused on typing more than I ever did writing. And then, in middle school, I took like some kind of elective class on HTML. So I was writing HTML, in sixth grade and thought it was so cool. And they also had some stuff on HyperCard, which never took off, but that was like an
Yep.
old, Apple product that was ahead of its time. And then in high school, this girl that I was dating at the time, I was visiting her and her family, and her mother was in community college, and she was learning about Linux. So she was running Red Hat Linux, like old school Red Hat, like the ones that came in a box,
Yeah.
and was running KDE on her machine. And I saw this UI that I did not recognize. I'm like, what is this? And she's like, oh yeah, this is Linux. It's free software, and turned me on to the whole free software foundation. And after that, it took off. Like a few years later, I was running Linux, as a daily driver, and being that zealot that I'm sure you have met, decades past, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to confirm, you said Zealot. Are you a Linux on desktop guy? I need to know.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I'm talking to you right now using Ubuntu LTS. I'm even running the i3 window manager. I am a turbo nerd over here.
Okay. Okay. Well, we have
Oh
some
yeah.
others in the audience, I'm sure as well. So, but
Mm.
that's great. And then, I guess in between that experience and then fast forward to your meta experience, but like what was the first time you were asked to like, I'll say carry a pager because it probably was a physical, pager at that point, but like, well, what was the first time someone said, hey, carry this thing and be ready in case something goes wrong?
Oh yeah. I was working at my alma mater right around the time of my graduation. I was working at a supercompute center called University of South Florida Research Computing.
Nice.
So I was responsible for monitoring all of the critical systems that enabled compute jobs to run, like, NFS and, identity management services and SunGrid Engine when that was a thing. And that was the stuff that we were responsible for. The compute jobs and the nodes, like we can deal with during business hours, but we did have those. And there was an incident that happened on my watch that was really terrifying, which was that we had a really tiny data center on the sixth floor of the library, and the air handler failed, and it practically burnt down the server room. Like the temperature was like 100 plus degrees, and it was a big incident. But yeah, that was my first exposure. We were using Nagios at the
Hmm.
time, like
Yep.
old school Nagios. Like they didn't even have like time series
Mm.
storage. It was just do a check and throw an alert at us over SMS.
Yeah, I guess it pretty much was like HP OpenView and like Nagios were the two like, kind of big players in that kind of that
Right.
period.
Oh
But
yeah.
I mean, I guess in that experience, you mentioned data center, right? And many people on the line today, have not been in a physical data center kind of before. Like, would you trade it? Would you trade it to cloud to go back to data center, or like, how do you think about the trade-offs?
Oh, that's so funny. I mean, I will tell you something. HPC is a
Hmm.
really cool thing, um, in that you are doing cutting edge stuff. You're using like InfiniBand and really
Hmm.
interesting networking and interconnects. But it is a pain in the butt to deal with the physical hardware, the rack and stack, troubleshooting, hardware chassis and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So the convenience of cloud really is what keeps me away from going back to the data center, because when I want a server, I just want to make an API call and get it, not
Hmm.
requisition a ticket and have some IT department, get it for me,
Yeah.
which can take a really long time. So I think I wouldn't go back unless there was a really cool niche reason to
Yeah.
do it.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, and there's a bunch of different movements now around repatriation and things like that. But we'll save that for
Sure.
another conversation. But like, okay, so look, the juxtaposition, like you mentioned, the community college, working in the data center there, and then fast forward to Meta, and I believe you were running or responsible for helping what 15% of the services, keeping them up and running. Is that correct?
Yes. So I was the first production engineer, which is their term for SRE. I was the first production engineer on a team of 20 engineers, many of them senior, responsible for a service called Smart Platform. It is a internal Heroku of sorts.
Mhm.
And as they grew, they got to the point where 15% of all backend services that ran at Meta were running on our service. And it was a wild ride getting to that milestone, and I'm very proud of that accomplishment, and so were other members of my team. But yeah.
Awesome. And have you kept up? Is that platform like, is it now like a larger percentage running on that platform, or like, or do you have any visibility, or is it?
I mean, from what I understand, because of course I haven't been in the company for 18
Yep.
months, that service still exists, but the business is trying to build the logical successor where they're trying to make it really easy to provision, launch, run, and operate general purpose services that are more complicated than, let's say, what a Heroku service would be, which is like, something that doesn't have state, or state is stored
Mhm.
elsewhere, and you might only have maybe a few hosts, in the cloud somewhere running your workload, right?
Yeah. And I guess, I mean, obviously that's huge, right? And
Oh
like
yeah.
when if that goes down or that has any interruption, kind of the world knows about it, right? And
Mhm.
that's a unique scale. So as a manager, production engineering manager, SRE manager, like
Yeah.
what strategies did you put in place to help, make your team effective in that environment?
Oh, 100%. So I was at Meta for 3 years. The first two, I was a production engineer, but a tech lead, and then the final year I was a manager. So the strategies that I implemented kind of span, between leadership and management. But let's talk about those. Number one is really around alignment of incentives. So software engineers are evaluated in a certain way, um, and that's consistent, across the company. And of course, one of the big things that software engineers are judged on, year to year, as to whether or not they get promoted or whether or not they get a bonus, or are rated properly or rated well, is, are they delivering features? That's obvious. So one of the first things I had to do was work with management to say, listen, we need to operate the service. Are we including the task of running production into your decision making as to whether or not they're meeting expectations or not? And of course, they cooperated with me because this was a infrastructure service that a whole bunch of teams depended on. Reliability was very important. So the moment that we did that, I had engineers coming to me saying, "Oh, Amin, do you have any reliability work for me? What kind of stuff can we collaborate on together?" And that was a huge thing
Yep.
because, alignment of incentives, I think across the board, any business is really, really important. But in the world of DevOps and SRE and operations is really, really key because you want engineering to take part in this task. You can't do it on your own. So that was the first thing. Similarly, one of the things I had to do was coach and teach engineering on how to do operational ownership. So a really good example was in the beginning when I was the first PE, I introduced the concept of blameless postmortems. So every time we had an incident, I was moderating that meeting,
Mhm.
and making sure that all of the action items that were revealed as part of that conversation was tracked in our backlog so that it could be prioritized, done, and the system improves. Well, eventually I handed off that role to a senior engineer
Yep.
who then handed it off, to a rotation of the engineers on the team. So now they started to own the responsibility of facilitating postmortems. And we did similarly for, maintaining the service level objective process and, many other tasks. And the whole point behind that is as a SRE, you can't expect to be embedded on a team forever. There is going to be a point where you're going to find a team that's even more on fire, and you need to go where you're sent.
Hmm. Yep.
So the goal is the engineering team is able to run production on their own without your input, and that you're able to go on vacation, for example, and things continue to run. So delegation of operational ownership is key because you build it, you run it. And for even smaller organizations, that's true. You don't have a dedicated SRE team or ops team to run stuff for you. You have to learn how to do it on your own. Um, Another thing was definitely data-driven decision making. So, engineers can complain about things, but that's very qualitative. Bringing that into the quantitative world and being able to use it to make decisions is really, really key, getting information for that. So that's why we introduced SLOs, because that's a quantification of customer success. Um, we did the same thing for alert volume and ticket volume, because you had, users of the system that would file support requests into us. And being able to quantify and classify them allowed us to understand, oh, okay, what work can we do to get those things down? Because that's all operational load. That's time not spent writing
Yep.
features.
Yep.
So understanding that information allows you to make decisions. And then finally, I was working a lot on culture. So in creating a environment where we learn from failure, we're not hiding failure because we're not afraid. We're creating psychological safety when we're discussing incidents, when we're discussing problems. um, you know, Getting people to actually declare an incident and know that it's okay to do it, and we encourage you to do it, was a big piece because, in the past they were like slow burn incidents that people didn't want to press the
Hmm.
big red button for because they're afraid they're going to be punished or there'd be some kind of problem.
Yep.
By the time I left, there was never a question like, oh, something's kind of weird with the system. There's a regression in performance. I'm just gonna, declare an incident and get down to it. So that was a big shift. So those were like, I know I've been describing a lot of leadership and people things, but here's the secret. There's always going to be technical problems that you solve, but the value that you provide as an SRE, especially when you're like a tech lead and you're driving things, like driving reliability across the team over time, it's a cultural thing. It's a social thing. And we can't, forget that. We're not just like launching Kubernetes clusters and building Grafana dashboards. We're
Yeah.
winning hearts and minds of people.
Yeah, no, and I think, as you were going through that, I think one of the things we often, as engineers don't think about is like just even change management and like, how do you, like you mentioned, like the incentive or things like that. Obviously, you can't just send an email and say, hey, now everyone's being, got to measured on this. There's the, change management process and like, the airing of grievances and, all the other, stages, if you will, that kind of go
Yes.
through. But we have a, really technical audience. So I think to make it real for them, how about we, like, if you can, I don't want to get you in trouble now with with Meta, but if you have a public incident that you can like walk us through and tell us how some of these strategies played a role or some of the technologies that were involved, we'd love to dive into it.
I'll do my best. So it's not a public incident, as in I don't think the public would have noticed that this happened, but a good chunk of the company did.
Okay.
Okay.
Awesome.
And one of the things that is good about Meta or any large company is they are able to gracefully degrade. And this is one of those situations where, for the most part, that they did. So the user, would never know about this. Well, anyway, okay. So again, I was the first PE on Smart Platform. Smart Platform's an internal Heroku. So one of the services that we depend on to run was an internal capacity service. So this service had information about all of the users that ran services on us, and we were able to gather information about the maximum capacity that they had. So that way, we're not ever asking the system to provision more than they were allowed to have. That system was undergoing some changes. They were making some significant changes to their API endpoints, and they did a release. And the problem was, as part of this release, instead of throwing errors saying, hey, come back later, I can't respond to your request right now because I'm undergoing changes, the API returned 0 for any of the capacity requests that we were sending. And we're constantly sending it all the time because we have a control plane, and that control plane implements changes to all of our client stacks. So our system was like, oh, 0 capacity, and it happily went and turned off the infra on a whole bunch of our client services, in essence, killing a whole bunch of services and creating downtime. And the on-call, of course, filed an incident. It was a big one. It was the biggest one we ever had. And he, mobilized the team, and there was a manual effort to look back at what the capacity was for all of those and recover them and slowly bring them back up. My role in that incident was, making sure it was properly documented, that we had all of the metrics and the write up there, and tracking all of the work, because we had to present this incident in front of the entire company. Because they have incident reviews. They call them SEV reviews. SEV is site event. And you have the lower team one, you have the departmental one, you have the main one. If you're in the main one, the main one's the fun one. So I was called out by name by the VP of platform there, because I was the head PE on the team, and he's like, "Listen, I just want to let you know, this service is not ready for internal production at this time." And that was the fire under the collective team's butts to really focus on reliability. As Rahm Emanuel said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." But that was the big incident. We depended on an upstream service for state. We trusted that data, and we killed a whole bunch of services. And that was a really stressful week or two going through.
Yeah, and I can only imagine. I can only imagine. I mean, and first of all, thanks for sharing it. So for our community here, we got an exclusive look at a major incident that doesn't seem to be published out there. And as you think about the cause itself, you were mentioning like there was a dependent kind of service you were dependent on, and it had an issue. Or was that service under your purview as well?
No.
Okay, gotcha.
The funny thing about FANG or any large big tech companies is that, because of their scale, It's not like you use a cloud vendor for a lot of stuff. Every team is building their own thing, and there's a constellation of distributed systems that go all the way down to data center.
Yep.
Right. So
Yep.
and every service has its own team. So it was a cross team collaboration thing.
Yep.
So that was an interesting, angle.
Yeah, and did you have visibility into kind of the postmortem on that services side? Like, what was the ultimate? Was it just like what caused that? Kind of zero value to be returned for all the capacity calls.
Right. For sure. I think like any other service, there was a lack of awareness of the downstream impacts. I think when you work in an environment like that, you sometimes forget that there's probably thousands of people that depend on you. So the reliability posture that they had in terms of doing their change management, as in I am making changes to the system, probably didn't have the level of rigor that they needed. Right. So yeah, I think like the root cause was more of a process and maturity thing rather than like a technical one.
Yeah.
It was a bug.
Yeah, yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think, in vain with that, I mean, as we think about, we talk to a lot of SREs and SRE leaders, et cetera.
Sure.
And one of the most interesting things, I guess you mentioned even Nagios earlier, right? And I
Yeah.
think I would say it feels today, and you can completely disagree, but it feels today like most organizations, like maybe don't have like a visibility problem. They have like a signal noise problem, right? So like, a lot of customers they have alerts, right? There's not like there's no alerting or monitoring, but they may have 26,000 alerts or,
Yes.
100,000 alerts over a weekend. And like, eventually
Yes.
that just becomes like, well, what do I do with that? So, I mean, as the teams you work with now or teams that you've worked with in the past, like how would you characterize it? Because what we often see is just teams just getting alerted on these like symptoms, but really kind of figuring out like what's actually like the problem still seems to be kind of intractable for most organizations. So
Oh, absolutely. So we got two problems here. The what and the why. So when we're talking about the what, do we have a clear handle on the key metrics that demonstrate that a service is in fact functioning and meeting customer expectations? Of course, I'm talking about service level objectives because I'm an SRE and that's one of the big tools in our
mhm.
arsenal, right?
Yep.
So that's the what. And a lot of teams struggle with defining them or don't define them at all. And so, they're flying blind in that respect because they don't know if the system's really healthy,
Mhm.
which is a pain in the butt, or they're using just the wrong metrics, right? Um, which can happen all the time. And then you got the why. And what's happening is that a lot of teams are monitoring, like if we go back to classic sysadmin days, we have Nagios sending alerts if the CPU is too high. Does that matter? Is
Mhm.
it okay? I mean, let me tell you something. If you're in an HPC environment, you want the CPU to be at
Mhm.
100% literally all the time. So why are you sending alerts on that? That's of course supposed to be the case. Um, so yeah, you have this situation where you have engineering teams that don't even know what the what should be, and then they're setting up alerts on the why, which is wrong. So you end up
Mhm.
with a situation where you have a billion alerts coming into your system, or rather, more accurately, I don't want to be hyperbolic, but like hundreds or thousands of alerts, and you don't really know what's an emergency. You deal with alerts fatigue, and then you just plain ignore it. So when I started on Smart Platform, they just launched into internal beta, and they had hundreds of alerts a week. And I'm asking the team, like, what is this stuff?
Mhm.
Does this stuff matter? And they're like, oh, we just ignore it. I'm like, no.
Mhm.
And I realized that was one of the first things I needed to work on, which was to get SLOs on the board and get alerts based on those. And down the road we eliminated like 85 to 80 90% of all alerts, and that the ones that did hit us were in fact emergencies, or at least things that we need to pay attention to in the short order.
Yeah. And maybe just to dive a little bit deeper on the why side of the house,
Right.
my experience and many members of our community's experience is that it still at some point requires, a human being to like quote unquote like jump on a server and like kind of figure out like what's going on or
Yeah.
to like do some complex analysis of code or memory, etc. Even like once that pager goes off. So I guess if you think about your experiences, is there any where that you've worked where you think that that lead time has been compressed or that the manual effort has been compressed? I'm kind of curious what tools you've seen contribute to that.
Sure. So as in shortening of time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I could talk about this because like Meta has published stuff about this service. They have a really interesting tool called Scuba, where it is a planetary scale logging system and with a web UI that allows you to slice and dice, your data. And the whole point behind it is that you're able to send arbitrary cardinality in your logs. So you have tags on all kinds of things: what server the log came from, latency, IP address, client, whatever. And with that information, you're able to isolate, tags that come out in frequency in terms of alerts. Like for example, let's say you're getting a bunch of errors in your app. Well, if you're slicing and dicing on your tags, maybe you can find that, oh, this particular method or this particular API endpoint is 80 to 90% of the flow of alerts. Okay, well now you've isolated it to a very small scope, and you're able to get to the major contributing factor, or root cause, or whatever you want to call it, more quickly. So I think that's a great example of how you can reduce the amount of time between getting alerted to understanding, oh, this thing is broken.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I think and I'll put that, I guess, still in the category of like kind of top down analysis, right? Where it still takes a human being to be able to slice the data and things like that.
Sure,
But
yeah.
let's say an incident like, some you've dealt with, or let's say that latency. Let's say there's a high latency event and you end up finding out that it's caused by an N+1 query or something that a developer introduced, right? Or something like
Right.
that. Um,
Yeah.
there's also, the kind of the bottoms up approach, right? Is versus, hey, let's not wait for that symptom to like manifest itself hundreds of times, dozens of times, thousands of times, et cetera. Let's actually proactively, right, look for that quote unquote class of problem, kind of across the code base. So that's definitely an area we see teams wanting to do more around. And as I mentioned the community earlier, that's really one of the goals of detect.sh is to enable people to share lessons learned on, hey, how do you detect an N+1 query, right? Or how do you look for memory leaks or deadlocks or things like that, so that you don't have to spend as much time, in a top-down approach where it's very kind of like some symptom-based and things like that. So I don't know if any other notes or thoughts on that.
Oh, absolutely. So let's rewind a little bit to my time at Acquia. One of the big things that we ops people had to do when diagnosing issues with customer sites. Now, this was Drupal, so LAMP stack. We were
Mhm.
using strace a lot,
Hmm.
more than you would probably like want to admit. Like we were attaching system call tracers to
Hmm.
running PHP processes and looking at the individual system
Hmm.
calls that the website was doing. Like, oh, it's trying to read this file off of a
Hmm.
network file system,
Yeah.
and look, the time it took to do that read operation was 5 seconds. Well, of course we're dealing with a performance problem. Look at how slow the write is. So we were having to, yeah, bottom up, like basically find metrics that the system wasn't necessarily exposing. Like we had to go and, I mean, tracing system calls is kind of an advanced topic for a lot of people.
Yeah,
And
exactly,
that was a daily tool that we had to bust out with
exactly.
to diagnose performance problems.
Exactly. And as we think
Yeah.
about organizations just generally, right? The average organization isn't, every seat isn't filled by someone who, and maybe it shouldn't have to be, right? Filled by someone who knows how to like analyze memory or, use strace and then all these different
Right.
things and things like that, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think as organizations are thinking about this area, there's definitely kind of a gap in terms of how do they kind of tackle it, because yeah, it's not conceivable for these to be in everyone's arsenal all the time. So,
Right.
we're actively focused on sharing, letting teams share best practices as tools emerge in the community,
Yes.
making people aware of those, so that piece, still seems to be a place where both time, effort, energy needs to be compressed so that teams can focus on, shipping features versus having to being pulled off and focused on like troubleshooting some of these items for sure. And even
Mhm.
earlier, you mentioned some of like kind of the low and slow failures, right? And obviously, a lot of things we hear about are kind of the gray failures where you're not getting an error message or you're not. There's no flashing red light yet, but certainly the kind of the story is unfolding, and if not addressed, there will be a kind of a bad day down the line as well. So
I mean, absolutely. Ideally, your incident response process should expand in scope, where in the beginning you're just thinking about emergency and you're focusing on that.
yeah,
But then later you should be like, oh, there is a deviation that could become an incident. Let's respond to that quickly. And then what you end up with is your incident response process is is more and more sensitive, meaning your system over time is becoming more and more reliable because you're increasing the standard of the consistency of performance of your stack.
yeah, yeah. And as you were mentioning some of the tracing tools you were leveraging there, immediately thought of Brendan and Greg, right? And obviously,
Yeah,
there's
of
been a lot of work
course.
done in eBPF, et cetera.
Oh yeah.
And there's the use method, which some organizations are leveraging, et cetera. Was that something in your tool belt at some of your previous gigs?
Absolutely. I mean, it was something that I definitely coached my teams on across my career from Acquia to Meta. Um, right? It was something that we needed to pull out. Sometimes during incidents where we didn't really understand what was going on and we needed to get a fresh look at things, as well as when taking on a new service, exposing the sources of data that could trend to a failure. So right, use method for every resource check, utilization, saturation, errors, USE, use method.
Mhm. Yep.
Mhm.
Great. And obviously, we talked about large big tech. We talked about some of your experience, at data centers, community college,
Yeah,
or local college, I should say.
yeah.
But also as you think about, so scale takes a different number of different forms, right? To
Oh
some
yeah.
businesses, their first, 100 servers or 100 instances is scale. So how do you think about the gradient there, right? An organization, maybe they just have a handful of EC2 instances and like they're thinking about reliability, but know that the most important thing maybe right now is shipping features,
Yeah.
versus like an organization with 1,000, instances and, maybe they're running Kubernetes and we could dive more into that. So how
Sure.
do you kind of think about the different, and kind of inflection points from an engineering organization perspective, and as it relates to SRE?
Yeah, definitely. So, one of the big SRE, premises that we talk about is toil. So that's the manual effort involved in maintaining and operating a production system. So there is a point, and I definitely experienced this point where the number of customers, which translates to the number of instances and workloads, the manual effort required to keep it going starts to have an exponential relationship. And that means that the amount of time that you have towards value add is significantly hampered. Um, so usually that is a function of success, believe it or not. Like you got your major logos, and now the rest of the market's following because you got your credibility. But then what ends up happening is that the reliability that the major logos enjoyed because they were like the first three is actually impacted because now it's not three, it's 30 or 300. And that usually is where things start to get challenging.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And what advice would you give an organization who's like either anticipating that point or feeling that inflection point?
Totally. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, you're going to get some really free advice here. This is fantastic for you. So like when we're talking about, like from hundreds to 1,000, there's some basics that you really, really have. Hopefully you're not, tending to these machines by hand. Do you have a configuration management system? Are you using something like Ansible or Terraform or something where you have consistency in how the hosts are spun up and configured? You're never SSHing in and doing it on your own. You're not doing click ops, right? Which is kind of a big thing actually in, these days where people would just go and click and spin up their infrastructure. Well, now there's not a repeatable process to maintain that stuff.
Mhm.
So you need to have that. Down the road, you probably want an asset management system. I mean, in the beginning, it could be as simple as EC2 tags, or you might want to have some kind of database that's like, okay, what are all these instances for? What are all these workloads for? Because if you don't know what they are and who they belong to, you could be wasting money on, compute resources doing absolutely nothing. You need to document your manual processes. Like I was talking about at that inflection point, you start by, okay, what is everything that people are doing by hand that's in the mind of one person? Get it into a wiki, and then aggressively automate it away with either tooling or full-on features that do all of that stuff for you. And you have to be aggressive. And I mean aggressive, I mean like every week you're discussing it as part of work retrospectives or on-call retrospectives or whatever, because all of that is wasted time. Like toil is wasted time, right? Similarly, you need a well-defined process for releases or configuration changes, whatever changes you're making to production. There needs to be a way that anybody on the team can do it and be able to roll it back and understand risk and all of that good stuff. So that's like, up to 1,000. You need to have those fundamentals in place, right? And we're just talking about managing the scale. I haven't even talked about observability, monitoring, on-call. There's like a billion things, but I don't want to hijack this webinar. Now, when we're talking about 1,000, a hyperscale, your philosophy has to shift a little bit. Hopefully you're not launching and maintaining, instances, stamping them out. The point here is now you need to be thinking about the old adage of cattle versus pets. You're not SSHing into the machines at all and making any changes. You're not patching them. They are immutable, and you can, blow them out and destroy them at any time. Because you should never have a situation where you need to make a change on a host at this point. Because if you do, the amount of toil required to maintain the fleet would be absolutely enormous. Right? Container images, like, how are you running your workloads and your OSs in a way that are consistent? If you can't do containers and you have to do VMs, one of the things I did was like version our Ubuntu mirror, and then we're pointing our fleet to a certain version, so that way the entire fleet is running the same version of everything. Because if you're not careful, you can have drift where there are servers with running like months apart versions of stuff, and that can cause all kinds of weird things in the system. Right? So you want a homogeneous fleet. When you're getting gigantic, you're thinking about auto remediation for failing hosts, especially if you're in the data center, because given the failure rate of an individual host, you do that en masse, something's always going to be down. So you need to have a way to automatically handle, the common failures rather than you doing it on your own. Are you doing CI/CD at this point? Because hopefully you're not trying to manually release to thousands upon thousands of machines. It should be automated. And there's other techniques like phased rollout, like A/B, feature flagging, so that way you're able to minimize the blast radius when making changes and releasing new things and doing features. And at this point, again, you're being aggressive about sources of alerts and those support tickets, like classifying them and getting them out of there. And then, like, finally, to end with, I want to end with this. One of the things that SREs do, but probably don't do often because we're always thinking about like incident response and observability, but this is related, is performance engineering. Because when you're at a certain scale, a 1 to 5% performance improvement actually means a lot of money. So you have to be thinking about that. You have to think about capacity planning. How much infrastructure do you need to add? How much is it going to cost? Because in those situations, little movements actually mean a lot of cash. So performance engineering becomes a very important skill at that scale.
Yeah, and there's obviously the overlap where performance engineering / availability, right? If things are so slow, et cetera, not using resources appropriately, there'll be some availability impact as well there. Great, and that's awesome insights so free advice for the attendees here, and maybe just to kind of like zoom out a bit. Obviously, you mentioned earlier you left Meta. I think you said 18 months ago or so.
Yes, that's right. I was affected by the very famed layoffs.
Yeah. Yeah. And what are you doing these days? How are you all this knowledge you've accumulated over the years? How are you applying it?
That's right. So I at that time I launched my own consultancy called Certo Modo. And what I do is I transform struggling software engineering and IT teams and their production systems into lean, mean, value creating machines using DevOps, SRE, and Agile. So I took all of that experience and now I help tech companies with, launch, and with that inflection point
Yeah.
that we're talking about. That's my specialty. So I've worked with, the typical Silicon Valley new early stage startup that needs to learn the ropes. And I've worked with, manufacturing companies that have IT processes that are a decade old and they need a refresh. So I've worked across the spectrum. But yeah, I took everything I learned because, as a professional, I've dealt with a lot of on call. I've dealt with a lot of stress, and I've seen the stress on the faces of my peers. So I get a lot of fulfillment out of helping teams, eliminate the sources of that stress, and have engineers have more, balanced lives and spend time with family and do all that stuff. So that's why I'm in it.
Awesome. No, sounds like you're getting to, apply your knowledge in a way that's helping people. And I mean, you mentioned kind of the inflection point and the gradient of customers there. What's like too small for you to kind of like work with them?
Oh, that's really interesting. I don't know if there is too
Mhm.
small. I mean, the funny thing, so that's really funny because I recently did a webinar. Um, I have this like term called lean SRE.
Mhm.
And the idea behind lean SRE is when SRE was developed by Google and friends back in the ancient days, it was for a gigantic company. Um, but SRE techniques are applicable to teams of any size. And I think it's even more important for like the tiny 5 to 6 people teams, because if you're not paying attention to it, the moment that you launch, you're going to trip over all of these problems. You're going to go down, you're going to burn customer goodwill, and then you're not even going to make it. You're going to run out of runway. Um, so, I mean, I think I can provide services to really tiny startups. And I think that makes sense because that's at the stage where they can't hire an entire, site reliability engineering team and staff that up and then like, hand on call to them or whatever they want to do. In that stage, like they're owning it. So I would be very effective in showing teams how to do that.
Great. And we do have a question in the chat around that. So I kind of want to just elaborate a little bit there. So
Of
obviously, I
course.
think one of the things that we know, right, is that like Google, Meta, these large organizations, they have different circumstances, right? So there
Mhm.
are different, they can structure their organization certain ways to deal with issues and things like that. They could have dedicated teams for certain things, whereas, a startup or a pre-IPO company, just simply can't do that. So I like the phrasing lean SRE. And one of the questions in the chat was how would you contrast that from if somebody just goes and buys the SRE kind of cookbook, right? Like how does lean SRE kind of like, compare and contrast to like, that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I mean, I think the thing about the SRE cookbook and other books, again, I think it's coming from a certain perspective, which is I'm in my ivory tower and I have these resources. I'm trying to come at it from the place of I am an engineer, or I'm like a single engineer that cares about ops. I might be in a team of 3 to 4 people, maybe even that. How can what is the bare minimum set of processes to have a continually improving feedback loop where you're able to work yourself out of the reliability struggles? So instead of thinking about like the generalized
Hmm.
um, practice of SRE, I'm thinking about it of how do you like you just got hired and you got dropped into a team.
Yep.
Um, what are the steps you need to do right now in order to even begin the reliability journey and not waste time or cycles or achieving that? So this premise that I've been developing and working on and did a webinar on and making materials for is really from that perspective. Because regardless of team size, believe it or not, or company size, it's actually really hard to get, momentum in getting
Hmm.
the team involved in doing, reliability work. So a lot of the things that I talk about is trying to, shorten that time frame.
Yeah, no, that's great, and definitely much needed, right? I
Mm,
talked to a lot of SREs and a lot of SRE managers and engineering managers, et cetera, and definitely knowing where to start, knowing how to take these kind of maybe best practices and like really align that with like what an organization needs today, this week, this month is a
right.
place that where the kind of team struggle. And we're almost out of time, and I want to make a little bit of time just to hear you kind of any kind of final thoughts. But one other question, I guess, um, I guess the pendulum always swings kind of back and forth. And you mentioned containers a bit earlier. So one thing we definitely see teams struggling with is kind of like either post Kubernetes, complexity, or even thinking around, hey, like everyone's doing Kubernetes. Should I be doing Kubernetes? So I don't know if any of your recent, clients, this has been like a topic that has come up. And just kind of curious, and maybe a little, got a case study here. Like how do you approach that? How would you approach that, or advise a client to approach a decision like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Kubernetes is a great tool when you are operating at a scale that is large enough where you need to really accelerate the process of launching production, like services. If you are a startup and you have 10 engineers and you are building a single application and maybe only have a handful of services that construct that application, I would seriously pause before going in on Kubernetes. Why? Because the system is so complex that the amount of time that you're going to take building, tending to, learning about, operating, upgrading, it's going to be a very expensive thing. Use simpler cloud primitives. Use auto scale groups. Use Lambda. Don't jump into the Kubernetes bandwagon because people, I mean, it's a hot topic. And I'm sure it's very lucrative for people out in the industry to know it. But when you're like young, like I think you should take a step back and look at the basics. Okay, I have an application I need to run. I have a database. I have a file system. Well, there are cloud products out there that you can provision immediately and hook them together and get going. You don't need Kubernetes right now. Like when you are gigantic and you have tens of engineering teams and they're all trying to figure out like how to, run their production systems in a way that is consistent, in a way that saves money, then that makes a whole lot of sense because now you're able to standardize. And that's like the platform engineering angle. But I wouldn't recommend touching it for that. Though I will provide a counter example just to be fair. It can be really good for CI/CD mechanisms. Just to spin up test dev environments, you're able to get stuff up in a matter of seconds rather than the time it can take to even spin up a VM. So there are niche cases where a Kubernetes cluster in the corner somewhere could actually be really useful. But for running prod, I would wait until you are large enough where it makes sense and you are willing to pay a team to run, maintain, operate, monitor, because it's a production system. It is an infrastructure service.
Yep. Well, I mean, definitely appreciate that insight. And maybe, two quick things. Any final thoughts? And hey, how do people get in touch with you?
Oh, absolutely. So my website is certomodo.io. That's CERTOMODO.io. I'm also available on LinkedIn as Amin Astaneh. I'm always looking for clients. So definitely check me out. And if you're interested in me jumping in your team or in your company to help you better run your production systems, I am here and I'm available.
Awesome. Well, internally grateful to you, Amin. And thanks everybody for joining today.
Lyndon, thank you so much.
See you at the next one.
Yep, looking forward to it.
Take care.